Since async operations like web service calls sometimes travel to slow and unreliable destinations, it can be useful to specify a timeout for async operations. ASP.NET already has a request timeout threshold, but you can be a bit more aggressive or different with these async methods by specifying a timeout value using an attribute. So the name of the attribute is Async Timeout, and you specify the timeout period in milliseconds. Let's go with 1200 milliseconds to force this to timeout, because we know those web service calls will require at least 2000 milliseconds. Now, once you have the attribute in place, you also need to take as a parameter to your async action a cancellation token, and I'll call it CTK. A cancellation token is something that normally you could pass around to other async methods. What the other async operations can do is check that token to see if someone has requested a cancellation. For instance, I could check cancellation token.can be canceled, is cancellation requested, automatically throw an operation canceled exception if the cancellation was requested. And typically what you would do is you would take that token and you would pass it into the async methods that you're calling. So in this case, ultimately, I'd want to pass it into the weather client get current temperature async, except the WCF proxies do not generate a method signature that takes a cancellation token, so there's really nothing I can do with it here. But there are a lot of .NET APIs where the async methods do take a cancellation token, then you can pass it in. Ostensibly, they should be checking that cancellation token and aborting any work in a friendly way in case cancellation was requested, and it'll clean up all the resources and be a little more efficient. But just with the async timeout in place and the cancellation token in place, let me do a quick build and come out into the browser. And what should happen now when I refresh this is that we should get an error because the operation is taking too long. And there we can see we get a system.timeout exception. Now I can customize that error message if I want, and this all goes back to error handling in ASP.NET MVC. We know there's a handle error attribute, and that handle error attribute will jump into play if custom errors are on. So off is great for debugging because you get to see stack traces, but on is what you want to use for production, or at least remote only, so that your customers see pretty error pages. And let's say that I want a specific error view dedicated to this timeout scenario. So I have a timeout.cshtml view that's here in the shared folder, and I want to render that when there's a system timeout exception. The way I can do that is add an additional handle error attribute here, and I could say that when the exception type equals type of, and the exception that we saw back there, which was a timeout exception, which is in the system namespace, so we'll bring that in. So when the exception is that type, then the view to render is going to be the timeout view. And now let me do another build. And we'll come back and refresh the browser. And this is what our users should see when this operation is taking too long. They should see this custom error view.